I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com is here with me. A very good evening. We go immediately to Hong Kong because in addition to the Ebola fears in the United States and the president holding an emergency meeting with his cabinet to speak of how the United States needs more aggression, more preparation, in addition to the president looking to meet with our allies in the coalition against the Islamic State, the resignation in Washington that the bombing campaign so far has not deterred the aggression of the Takfiri jihadists against the Kurds in the north of Syria, in addition to the fact that Vladimir Putin is headed to Milano within these next hours to meet with the president of Ukraine, who will surrender, and there being very much turmoil back in Kiev by right-wing elements who are looking to threaten that governance again. In addition to all that bad trouble, we've got trouble in Hong Kong. And, Gordon, a very good evening to you. We go immediately to Mike Davis, a professor of law at the University of Hong Kong. And, Mike, I'm pleased to hear that you're in stronger spirits. You're not as exhausted as you were when we last talked to you, but there's been bad news in Hong Kong the last, 24 hours, Gordon? The beating was 24 hours ago?
Wednesday morning, early Hong Kong time.
A young man who was beaten on video. His picture and the wounds are now on the front page of the South China Morning Post, and I recommend everyone can go to the site and follow very carefully what we're about to present. That beating has now been a feature of the abuse of the protesters by the police. The larger story, of course, is that Hong Kong's being abused by the betrayal of Beijing. I want to speak to the optics of this, as Mr. Obama says. There are all these tents out on Admiralty and Mong Kok and other parts of Hong Kong. They look very attractive tents, the sort of thing that you get at LL Bean or other tenting facilities. What are they doing out there camping out, Mike? Good morning to you.
Good morning. Yeah, they're really just trying to hold this territory because this is an Occupy movement, and so they're trying to, of course, throughout weeks of this, they can't sustain, just full crowds to just clog the area they're occupying, but rather have to have a longer-term strategy, and that has been to set up tents and camp out. And earlier in the process, I think a lot of people would go home in the nighttime and then come back in the morning. But now a lot of them stay on continuously. Some people was joking the other day that they're so organized, they have tents and they have their own cleanup crews and everything. Maybe soon they'll have electricity and running water. Who knows?
Well, they can run their own government. Probably would do a lot better than C.Y. Leung, who is the chief executive, in other words, the top political officer in Hong Kong. Mike, there was this terrible beating that was caught by a TV camera crew. Apparently, everybody in Hong Kong has now seen about the 4 minutes of the savagery of the Hong Kong police beating this guy who was handcuffed. What has been the effect on the people in Hong Kong? Not the protesters, but, the ordinary middle class. How have they viewed this, and what do they think about it?
Well, of course, everyone's kind of exhausted by this long protest process. And so I think before this, again, people were sort of hoping this would all come to an end, that the government would step up and actually talk to the protesters and try to understand what public concerns are. But of course, something like this just reignites people's anger with the government in general, which the government is generally viewed as serving Beijing's interests more than Hong Kong's interests. So this is, lurks behind the whole protest, this kind of concern about what this government is doing for Hong Kong people and how well they're represented. So when things like this happen, it reignites the public passions. We just don't know, how going forward, whether the government's going to keep having these missteps to keep public support for the protesters going. But there are a lot of people also concerned that the protest goes on too long. So we're sort of at an impasse right now.
Yeah, you would think that the government would learn after a while, but apparently they don't. We've seen this pattern, Mike, where during the weekdays when people have to go to work, the crowds in the Occupy protests sort of shrink. And then when we get to the weekend, people are off work, the crowds get bigger. Do you anticipate the crowds are going to get bigger this weekend, or are we going to see a new pattern?
I would expect it to get bigger after this news. Of this, because the beating was kind of really uncalled for. It wasn't a case of people struggling, on a police line. where police are trying to remove barricades or something and people are reacting against it, but rather the guy had already been cuffed by these plastic strips they use and was lying on the ground and being kicked. So that kind of thing, I think, is really not something we see often here in Hong Kong, and so I think ignites a lot of public concern. I think the biggest problem here is the government. You know, it's obvious to everyone that the Hong Kong government is the movable part here. It's the entity that could try to solve the problems, and what it would need to do is talk to protesters and then go from there to maybe represent better to Beijing what Hong Kong protesters and what the protests are about, because Beijing seems to be clueless. And so this is the problem, that the Hong Kong government is sort of stuck. It doesn't do anything for a while, and then it starts trying to shrink the protest area, but it doesn't actually deal with the problem. Even if they clear the streets, this problem is going to remain. This problem, the public has spoken. Even Li Ka-shing, who's very heavily pro-Beijing, said, "We heard you." You know, so that there's people out there who know that, you know, this problem is going to persist unless this government can find a way to better serve the Hong Kong interest.
Is anyone responsible for ordering the pepper spray? Not only did it not work, but also it showed that the authorities are impotent. They're in fact frightened of the demonstrators. And if anything demonstrates to me that this will continue, it was they took their best shot and they lost, Mike. They lost on camera.
Yeah, I know. It's the pepper spray. It's been part of their operation since the beginning of these protests, and they used it early on. When they switched to tear gas, then they really lost the hearts and minds of Hong Kong people. And now they seem to be sort of back to pepper spray because they want to shrink the area. They're removing barricades and so on. And the problem the protesters have is that in some of these, when they shrunk the area on one end of the protest the other day, some protesters then reoccupied an area that had been taken away from them the day before by the government headquarters. But one of the things is going on the protest side. Their problem is they don't have control over all the protesters. So a lot of the protest leaders who are committed to nonviolence are always saying to sort of pull back when these confrontations occur. But a lot of people that are there are not controlled by anyone, so they want to be more aggressive. And so that lack of discipline has been a problem for the protesters as well.
You know, Mike, we've seen a number of increasingly stern warnings from Beijing, some of them in People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China. How do people view these series of warnings? Is it ominous, or do people just take it in their stride and saying Beijing doesn't mean it?
Well, I think so far it's been the latter, that people think Beijing is, you know, putting out the smoke, not the fire yet. And so Beijing, of course, is always condemning foreign interference and things like that. Whenever there's a problem in China, it's almost always blamed on foreign interference instead of the government's policies. And so that's what they're doing here. This is why I think it's critical that the Hong Kong government step up on this and talk to the protesters and try really to represent Hong Kong interests. That would certainly gain them a lot more points in the battle for the hearts and minds of Hong Kong people. But I think it would also enable Beijing some avenues to step down a bit and try to find a solution to this. Rather, you know, in a way, this is all against Beijing's interests. They've caused a confrontation by their hardline policy, and the confrontation then produces exactly what they're trying to avoid, which is having challenges to their government from Hong Kong. They're actually stirring up those challenges.
Final question, Mike. I thought Beijing had gamed this out. There looked to be a very careful approach. First, the promise many years ago, and then issuing early, right, Gordon? The deadline was 2017. Issuing early, it's not going to happen. We're betraying you. And then waiting for the protest. It was planned for a long time. Occupy Central said what they were going to do. The protest showed up. I thought Beijing had phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. They don't, Mike. They don't have a plan. They're not even speaking of one voice anymore. There's a lot of finger pointing by the bad guys.
Yeah, well, it's hard to say. I think the game plan, Beijing has always had this idea that being repressive is the way to control dissent. They create a harmonious society by repressing people. And generally, when the society is an open society, that doesn't work. repression just causes more confrontation. And so Beijing really doesn't seem to have a game plan for handling an open society such as Hong Kong. And if it uses repressive techniques, then it will really destroy the very thing that has been so important in China's modernization, and that's Hong Kong's contribution.
Gordon, it tells me that we can use a joke. Wasn't this a joke that was used by Chou En-lai? It's too soon to tell. How did the Chinese Revolution work out? Too soon to tell, Gordon.
Well, the joke is that was talking about the French Revolution, and this was in the 1960s.
I know, but here we are in 2014. I think we can use it about Mao.
Yes, certainly.
Mike Davis of the University of Hong Kong Law School in Hong Kong on a beautiful morning with everybody camped out in Admiralty. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. Good morning, Admiralty. I'm John Batchelor.